Thank you. I have one diminishing hope as I look to my retirement, and I appreciate the kind words that these guys said, but at least once before I retire, I would like to be introduced with further ado. I have a burning desire to see what it looks like. It involves, in my mind, a man on a unicycle and a trombone and maybe some other factors. I'm very flattered to have been invited back to a place where I have spent so many years and learned so much. I am reminded of traditions as I look out at Widener Library, and things need to change as well as to be preserved. I appreciated the kind remarks about the financial reform bill, but I do believe there should be balance, and while it is true a number of people thought highly of the financial reform bill, the CEO of JP Morgan Chase thought it went too far. I thought I would just give both sides of the argument. I am reminded of that need to evolve by Widener Library because when I was here, there was still a requirement that students had to swim, I think it was 50 yards, before they could graduate. And I remember asking Nathan Pusey in my senior year what the connection was and why Harvard maintained a requirement that you would have to swim. And he said, apparently accurately, that it was because Harry Elkins Widener had drowned with the sinking of the Titanic. And it made me very grateful at the time that he had not gone down in a plane crash. I do want to live up to my obligation to give some advice. I do realize also, by the way, I'm here, the students are speaking and it's their day and they should be speaking and there'll be other important things. Most of you are here justifiably proud of the family member who's graduating and all you did. And I understand my role as a speaker here, particularly the alumni speaker. It's like singing the Star-Spangled Banner at the World Series. Nobody came to hear you. But it's not an official event unless you do it. And the only time anybody will remember you is if you screw it up real bad. So I hope not to be too memorable on this occasion. We have other things to think about. But I will give you some advice, drawing on my years. Some of it is practical. You will, if you get into some line of work like mine, from time to time be invited to places where people want to pay you tribute and hope that they lock you in on a couple things they're looking for, and they will try to seal that deal by giving you something. A mug, a t-shirt, a plaque. I have one very important piece of advice based on experience. Never throw anything out within 1 mile of where it was presented to you. You will find that very useful. Secondly, my niece Madeline is here, who is a junior. She is doing me the great favor. She has with me the kind of schleppy green carry-all I have, because one of the things I have learned is never give anybody else custody of something you're going to need if you want to leave early. Madeline, I thank you. I will also give you some advice about how, if you are in elected office, to stay out of trouble. Now, one way to stay out of trouble is, of course, to be perfect. For those of us who will find that hard, here are a couple of rules. One, and I know this goes counter to the culture of the young people today with all the electronics. I learned this in City Hall in Boston in 1967. And if you read the stories of indictments of people who have done insider trading or other things, you will understand its impact. Never write when you can talk, never talk when you can nod, and never nod when you can wink. I advise you that. Now, I don't know how you make your BlackBerry wink, but if I were you, I'd learn how to do it. I would also say, well, obviously, especially if you're in public office, you should be very law-abiding. If that isn't possible, there is a practical rule that is very, very important. Be sure that you obey every law that you have voted for. you can do that, you're probably doing pretty good. I left myself some wiggle room. Then there is a question of how do you approach public policy. I will cite one of the great philosophers of the 20th century, whom maybe the parents, maybe in some cases the grandparents will be familiar with. And he articulated a rule that I have found, it's a metric, it's a way to approach issues that I have found indispensable. His name was Henny Youngman. He was a great comedian. Yeah, the audiences know him less and less. And he was part of that comedy tradition of the 40s, 50s, and 60s when men made jokes about their mothers-in-law and their wives, etc. But he had one which was terribly profound and very funny. He did these kind of quick one-liners. How's your wife? Compared to what? Now, I'm pleased to be able to say that within 2 months, I will be able fully to make that my own, and I hope I will be asked, how's your husband? I'll be able to say, compared to what? But I recommend to you, I cannot think of a public policy decision I have had to make where I don't keep in mind compared to what, because I don't have the luxury of creating a new reality. And that then leads me into some semantic guides. First of all, do not, I'm a great believer in free speech. I would let anybody say anything about anybody, including, by the way, and I would just add to that remark I made to the woman whom I compared unfavorably to a dining room table. She had asked me why I was supporting a healthcare policy of President Obama, which was based on the Nazi philosophy. And I did not consider that to be the kind of question that required a civil answer. But I also went on to say that I am a great believer in the First Amendment, and I was glad that she had the right to say something so contemptible without any fear of any penalty. So I'm not for limiting what anybody says about anybody. I supported strongly a hate crimes bill, which amended the hate crimes law by adding sexual orientation and gender identity to the lists of motives that could enhance a sentence. Some of my colleagues said, well, but some of their ministers had said that would endanger their ability to say anti-gay things from the pulpit. And my answer was no. We are not trying to criminalize speech. We couldn't if we wanted to. We don't want to. This is only an added sentence enhancement for an otherwise criminal act. And I said, let me be very clear. I was at that time chairman of the Financial Services Committee. If this bill passes tomorrow, it will still be entirely legal to call me a fag. I just wouldn't recommend it if you're in the banking business. But there are some things I would at least discourage. First of all, please do not ever use the words pragmatic and idealistic as if they were opposites. If you are in public life and you are doing things that make people follow your policies, then you better be idealistic. You have no justification for that unless you are trying to make it a better world. But once you have a set of ideals, you are morally obligated to be pragmatic. What good are a set of ideals that are unrealized? They make you feel better, but they don't feed a hungry child or clean up a river or do anything to help anybody whatsoever. So I urge you, please, make sure that you are pragmatic in the service of your idealism and don't consider them opposite. Secondly, never use metaphors in the debate on public policy, particularly in foreign policy. There are no dominoes. Countries do not fall over and hit each other. One of the great minds of my time, Winston Churchill, debated whether or not to invade Europe through northern France, which was ultimately successful, or to do what he wanted to do, which was to go through the Mediterranean, attacking what he said was the soft underbelly of the Axis. Someone finally said to him, you know, Winston, the southern coast of France is no softer than the northern coast of France. Just because on a map it may vaguely resemble an animal is irrelevant. And people debate metaphors and take them as reality. Metaphors mislead you. Please try to avoid them. One other plea I would make, please do not use partisan, referring to political parties, as if it was a bad thing. I was going to be an academic before I went into politics. You may, if you followed more closely than anyone ought to, the introduction, wonder whether the introducer misspoke or whether the program did when it said that I graduated from the college in '61 and the law school in '77. 16 years is kind of a long stretch. Well, the answer is, in the interim, I was going to be an academic. And I will give you one other piece of advice, the graduating seniors. Try to find a line of work, if you can, where your personal characteristics are strengths and not weaknesses. And we all have characteristics. There can be a strength in one context and a weakness in another. I was going to be an academic and write a PhD thesis. I was here enrolled in the Graduate School of Arts and Sciences. The program gracefully notes that I attended the GSAS with no degree noted. That was kind of them. It's because I didn't get one. After a while, I left the academic world, not having completed a thesis, and went into politics. And I did it because I learned a lot about myself, and I recognized that I had one characteristic that was a drawback in an academic, but a great advantage in a politician. I have a very short attention span. If I were you, I probably would have already lost track of what I'm saying. The notion that you should try to overcome your weaknesses and force yourself to do what you're not good at has never made a great deal of sense to me. It always reminds me of the scene in Blazing Saddles, where the protagonist points a gun at his own head and marches himself off to jail to save himself from an angry mob. You can't live holding a gun to your own head. Try and go with your strength. But during that period, I did study a lot about democracy, and I am convinced of one thing, and this is very serious. There's never been a self-governing polity in the history of the world where you did not have political parties. Not because anybody wanted to create them, but because that is a natural tendency when people come together to avoid it just being personality. And that's especially important today. The political parties in America today are deeply divided on issues, more divided than they should be, in my view, but a fundamental divide is legitimate. And my one concern about President Obama, whom I greatly admire, during his campaign in 2008, was when he announced he was going to govern in a post-partisan manner. Frankly, I knew the other side, and I did not think that would be possible, and I feared he would lose out in trying. And I told a member of his staff that when he talked about governing in a post-partisan manner, he gave me post-partisan depression. I think he's experienced a little of it himself. Finally, I want to make one serious note. I have in my pocket the most important commencement speech ever given. I thought I'd look at it. It was given by Secretary of State George Marshall at the Harvard commencement on June 5th, 1947, when he announced the Marshall Plan. By the way, for those of us who are commencement speakers, here it is in its entirety. Every commencement speaker ought to know that George Marshall changed the world in 2 pages. Single spaced, but still 2 pages. And I cite it, one, to tell you how deeply flattered I am to be speaking the platform, although his speech was the tomorrow afternoon speech. But I'll take eminence by association, even with some distance. But it's a very important speech. It was a speech in which he announced the decision by the United States under Harry Truman, with some bipartisanship in the Senate, to go to the aid of a Europe that had been devastated by World War II, that was poor and hungry and defenseless, and facing a brutal Soviet Union. And for the intervening period, America has been a strong defender of Europe. But you know, that was 1947. We're 65 years later. Too little has changed in our policy. By the way, if you go back in time from Marshall's speech in 1947, as far as we are ahead from that time, the President of the United States is Chester Arthur. A lot changed between the days of Chester Arthur and Harry Truman. A lot's changed between Harry Truman and our day. There are people here, graduates, who will leave far more heavily indebted than a decent society ought to have made you do. There are young people who didn't get the education they could get because of that. We have needs that we are not addressing to improve the quality of our life, and part of that is that we are still treating our friends and now our economic equals in Europe as if they are our wards. So I've decided today I want to announce not simply that I congratulate the Harvard students graduating, But I think it's time for us to announce the graduation of Europe, 65 years after George Marshall's wonderful speech. The notion that America has to be the military bulwark for Europe, the notion that our European allies can have very little in the way of military spending because they can count on America to defend them, the notion that we have to have American troops in Europe and the Sixth Fleet as their major bulwark, it's commencement time. And there are places in the world where people need our help. But our continued treating Europe as a dependent, and we don't do it anymore economically with the Marshall Plan, that part of it, but the other part of the Marshall Plan was a military decision. At the time, and now we go to 1949 in NATO, Europe was poor and weak, and the Soviet Union was brutal, and while it was poor, Stalin was able to mobilize with that oppressive society all the resources to be military threatening. And so what we did, the United States, was to step in and protect poor and weak Europe from the brutal and aggressive Soviet Union. There is no longer a poor and weak Europe. There is no longer a brutal and aggressive Soviet Union. There's still a Russia, not my favorite country. I continue to be grateful my grandparents got the hell out of there. But it is not anything like what it was 60 some odd years ago. The only thing that hasn't changed is that America continues to commit tens of billions of dollars that we could otherwise use for very important purposes to improve the quality of lives both here and elsewhere, as if they still needed us. So I close by expressing my deep sense of honor that I share a platform 65 years later with one of the great men in American history, George Marshall, and a commemoration of one of the great unselfish undertakings in American history. But the time has come to say it was a success. The time has come to declare victory. And I read this, and I read about poor Europe, and I look at Europe today, and I say, good, it worked. So I close with this, for those of you who are about to go out and enter the political world. We have a decision to make as a country. Do we continue to act as if, in the aftermath of World War II, we had a requirement that we spend hundreds of billions of dollars a year, not simply protecting ourselves and our vital interests and some who need us, but whether we were going to spend all that money to be the dominant power everywhere in the world all the time, even when people don't need us. Because understand that's a choice. We cannot do that. We cannot continue that policy and still maintain a commitment to improving the quality of our lives at home. And so when people say to you, we cannot afford to do these things that I think many of you want to see done, I ask you to put that into the balance. And I would say, to quote myself, when I look at what we could do with some of those funds while still reducing a deficit, to improve the quality of life here at home, to spread education more widely, to improve the environment, to improve our physical lives, to support health research and all those other important things. Compared to what? Well, compared to continuing to act as if the rest of the world needed to shelter behind America and spend hundreds of billions of dollars far beyond our own legitimate needs on that purpose. I hope that is an issue with which you will engage, and I look forward to at least some of you being on our side as we write the balance. Happy commencement.